So we're really lucky today to have a gentleman who ranches on the Colorado-Wyoming border line. They're in this little Snake River Valley. Pat O'Toole is somebody that I think a number of you know, but for those of you who don't know Pat, not only does he find time to run a really big ranch, but he's all over the place. I mean, he shows up in Las Vegas and D.C., and Pat is the president of the Family Farm Alliance, which is a group that's really dedicated to the preservation of irrigated agriculture in the West. And so the cool thing about Pat is not only does he have deep knowledge in ranching and water in the West, but he has practical experience of trying to bring together environmental values with ranching values, with building water storage projects in ways that I think we can learn a lot from. And Pat's been there and has done it. So he gets to speak to us from the voice of experience and wisdom, I would add. And so if you will, please join me in welcoming Pat to the podium.
I have to tell you, this is a little daunting. It's a great crowd, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be here at a time when you all are starting to ask yourselves the hard questions about how do you want the Poudre River watershed to look. And the fellow that was moderating the other panel said, let's look ahead 45 years. Luke Rayner mentioned, let's look ahead 45 years. Well, I showed up in Fort Collins 45 years ago in June of 1970, 46 almost. And I came from the East, and I wanted to be here. And as I was coming out here to go to school, somebody said, you're going to go to the most beautiful town in America. And I drove here, and I mean, you just overwhelmed. And yet in those 45 years, it has changed significantly. And if you look ahead 45 years from now, if it changes as much as it has in the last, 4.5 decades, be unrecognizable in a lot of ways. And I think you're grappling with how you're going to deal with that. And so today I'm going to talk to you about some things that I do and both, on the political side, but also on the solution side. First of all, I was going to mention that I was at the stock show a couple of weeks ago, and I had a Stetson on. I was walking around, and here was this booth, and it said, Liberal Arts, Colorado State University. So I walked up, and there were two young ladies there, and I kind of said sternly, what do you mean liberal arts at the stock show? And they, sat back a little bit, and I said, well, I just wanted to talk to you about my degree in philosophy from Colorado State. And we had a great conversation, and perception is reality in many cases, and many of us have decided that different parts of what's going on in this basin have certain roles. Well, I can tell you that the future is that everybody's going to have a lot of different roles, and they're exciting roles. And you can look at it as a challenge, and you can look at it negatively, but the reality is you have the opportunity in this beautiful watershed to do a lot of different things. And part of what I'll talk about today in the slides, I'm not going to really talk to the slides, but they're things that are going on in our watershed with our family. And I wrote on top, family, community, watershed. That's how we look at what we do. And we're very, very lucky to have great leadership, and doing a lot of work, kind of following the philosophy that there is no inherent contradiction between conservation and production. And we like to put ourselves in different little pigeonholes of, I'm a conservation person and I'm a production person. But I can tell you that if you're smart enough to figure it out, you can do both. And it's exciting to do both. And what happened in our watershed really 3 decades ago was we had some people come in, and young people, and a guy took charge of our conservation district, and he was a guy that turned out to have as much vision as any human being I've been around. His name's Larry Hicks. He's a state senator in Wyoming. He's one of my good friends, and Mary Lou and Reagan and a lot of us have worked together on the times you get to sit back and say, what is it that we want for the future? But what Larry has done throughout his whole career is to actually do things on the ground. And some of these pictures that you see are what I call integrating your irrigation system and your fishery and your wildlife habitat. And really about 12 years ago, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I don't know if you all know exactly how the Fish and Wildlife Service is put together, but it's got, the main part is called Ecological Services. And to a great extent, they're the listers. They're the ones that are looking at how do we list. And then you have the refuge part, which are the people that work on the refuges. And then they have another part called Partners for Fish and Wildlife. And it's a smaller part of the Fish and Wildlife Service that has been there for 25 years and is dedicated. I describe it as sort of like how they recruit the CIA in a university. They find the really smart people that have communication skills, want to spend their career in one state, and they do things. And they're there to make sure that things don't get listed. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service came into our valley and began essentially with our ranch and said, would you like to look at, instead of doing push-up dams, and there was, in the cartoon this morning, there was a picture of push-up dams, which is what everybody still does in a lot of places. Why don't we look at some permanent structures and some habitat work? And through that process, we ended up doing it on our ranch, and people were going, what are they doing up there? Because we had, equipment in the river and moving big rocks around, and you'll see some of those slides in the picture. But what we've done is we've made our withdrawals from our irrigation system permanent. And then above and below those withdrawals are fishery habitat structures. And what you find when you begin working on any kind of a water course like the Poudre River is everything that you do has an effect. Negative effect, positive effect, but every time you touch water, it has an effect. And what we've learned over, 2.5 decades is that a much more sophisticated understanding of what that river can be. And I think you all are trying to do very many of the same things. But let me, talk a little bit about some of the other important things that you need to think about. And those questions, I could have just written down all those questions and talked about it all afternoon, but I have been on several different national level things for one reason or another. And one was 20 years ago, President Clinton had the ability to appoint a group that was to look 20 years into the future. So here we are 20 years later from that time. And the group was supposed to look at the West and decide what we were going to do with water in that 20-year period. And it was made up, interestingly, I was the only farmer rancher, with the exception of Ken Salazar, who had a ranch background. And it was really designed to do some of the same things we're debating today. Because the easy way of describing what we ought to do with growth is take the water from agriculture. It's easy. Once you do that, you don't have to worry. There's plenty of water until we run out. We can grow and grow and grow. That was the purpose of that commission. And Ken decided he wanted to be a senator, and he left and had a great career and became head of the Department of Interior. But the commission report was essentially about how do we take water from agriculture for growth and environmental needs. I was fortunate to be able to write a minority report, which was supported by all the Western states. And the reason for that is when the Western states came into the Union, they were given the rights to manage the water within their borders constitutionally. That's an important thing to understand. The other thing that's important to understand is that the same fellow that wrote about prior appropriation and the law of the river, as you saw earlier today, Edward Meade, who Lake Meade is named after, wrote the law of the river for Colorado, and he was a little dissatisfied with that, and so he moved to Wyoming and wrote the law of the river for Wyoming. The distinction is that in Colorado, the water is essentially a market. In Wyoming, it's tied to the land, and it has a lot of effect about how that water is used over a period of time. And I think philosophically, it's a pretty good thing to think about. What is it that we want that water to do? Because whether it's working 6 times in agriculture or the multiple times that it's working, in all the other uses, how you philosophically look at the system of water is really important, what you're going to come out with. Another thing I've been able to do is a group called Agree, and Agree was put together almost 4 years ago. The 9 biggest foundations, so Ford, Rockefeller, Gates, Hewlett-Packard, all said this issue of food production is so important that rather than all go our separate ways, let's put one kind of think tank together and look at. And here was the question: how do you feed 9.2 billion people sustainably in 30 to 35 years? And nobody argues about what the results of that question are. We have to virtually double the food supply. And we've talked a lot about food this morning and farmers. The reality is you cannot escape that reality. You cannot escape the fact that we have to produce that much food into our future. And so the idea of transferring water and land away from production is contrary to every intellectual analysis of what we need to do. And what was interesting is about 3 months after the 9.2 billion, some really smart person said, wait a minute, we forgot to count those 400 million people in sub-Saharan Africa. And so after 3 months, it was 9.6, and now we're creeping up to 10. And what you have to realize is that, you know, we're working on international issues, but right now, Google Ethiopia and Somalia, and you'll see the drought is just a devastation, heading for another incredible starvation issue in Zimbabwe, or you name a country in Africa. And starvation is the genesis of revolution. I don't have to tell you that. We're seeing it all over the world. And so this impetus to this, you know, to develop our food supply over the next 30 years is critically important to all of us. You know, coming from a school like CSU that's done so much work. I mean, it's amazing. You go anywhere in the country and you see somebody that's gone to school at ASU that's doing something important in food production. But when you look at you know, what your role is here in this community, in Weld County was the second most productive ag county in the world. I don't know where it ranks today, but I remember driving into Weld County and seeing that sign. Orange County, California, was the most productive ag county in the world. Most productive in the United States, thereby the world. It's Los Angeles now. And so you can make the decision to make a transfer of ag land to growth. And I don't know, I asked a good friend of mine last night how much, you know, from the time I got here 45 years ago, I wonder how much ag is still here. Maybe half, I don't know what it is. A lot more efficient probably, more efficient use of water. But as we grow and need to use our water for a variety of things, I think we need to be thinking about that sort of impetus that America has a very special responsibility to not only be America and all the great things that we are, but we have a responsibility to the rest of the world. And, you know, it's very difficult to watch the politics of today, you know, and kind of figure who is even talking about agriculture. Nobody. I mean, nobody was talking about agriculture. And I noticed last night, I looked at the internet and there was a terrible thing in Harper's Magazine about how terrible Iowa is and how terrible all those farmers and how do they get to be the first people to vote, you know, and dictate our presidential elections. And as a person that represents farmers in the 17 western states with the Family Farm Alliance, we've testified to Congress 50 times in the last 10 years. Is really, as you look at it from a big picture, it's really disappointing to see that there's an awful lot of that discussion that we really don't need ag, or ag is using too much water, or ag isn't doing the right things. The fact is we have the most wonderful integrated food supply in the history of the world. You know, and I sure love literature and philosophy, but the study of what American farmers have done is one of the great stories of Western civilization. And, you know, I was listening to the gentleman here that does the onions, and it was just a great defense of what he does. And there's a lot of people that say, well, let's become more efficient. We can take that water away from agriculture and use it for something else. He wants to grow more food. And one of my board of directors on the Family Farm Alliance, Ron Rayner from Arizona, is the same way. We have these debates. We're gonna become more efficient. And in reality, why don't we just use the water to grow more food? Because we need to grow more food. But we're not in that sort of matrix right now. That's not our paradigm. Our paradigm is let's be more efficient to save water for other things, growth particularly. I think what we've found in the Little Snake River and in these pictures is that you've seen is that we can do both of the things, at least for our part of the country, that are possible. And we have incredible herds of antelope, deer, elk, predators, fish, birds, and we've done it kind of. Our fishery wasn't really that great 25 years ago, but we began a process of, because of the Endangered Species Act, of reintroducing Colorado fish in the upper reaches of our river. That was sort of the impetus of why we began doing the structural work that now is river-wide. That's the beauty of it. It's not just our ranch and our part of the community, but the whole community has embraced it. We're the largest river restoration in the United States with NRCS, and we're the largest trout passage in the United States with Trout Unlimited. And what that meant was there was this day that all the irrigators were asked to come to Bags and come to the Conservation District, and Trout Unlimited was there. And you all know kind of the reputation of agriculture being pretty conservative, and to have had all the irrigators in there with Trout Unlimited, a decade ago, everybody was kind of wondering what it was all about. And our leader, the fellow that's done so much of this great work, said, we want to make this river, this whole system, every tributary, we want a trout to be able to go anywhere in the river. And it sounded just incredibly hard, but it really wasn't. And we decided to do that because of what you need among yourselves is trust. We trusted Larry. We trusted the stuff that he had already shown us that he could do. And we said, yeah, let's do it. And now that entire watershed is trout passage friendly. That's pretty cool. And it wasn't that it was onerous. It was that the feds, the good guys that wanted to work with us, decided to work with us. So when you embark upon your new, great effort that you're doing here, you have an opportunity, think about me. I came here in 1970, knew that I liked water policy, but I've ended up not only being able to be in policy, but to watch the kind of things that a community can do if they decide to work together. So, I just would throw that out as a challenge to you. Lay down your arms and your preconceived notions and get together, because this community is going to be what you decide to make it. And, I'll talk to you a little bit about, how the Family Farm Alliance perceives Western water. And Reagan talked about being in California and the incredible technology that's being done there. And I always tell people the Israelis come to the Central Valley to learn how to do efficiency. And that's true. And those guys have, as he said, iPhones, and they can open and close valves from anywhere where they're at in the country, because they're trying to figure how, with those high value crops, they can put in the most efficient systems, because they're relying on infinitesimal amounts of water in the context of what you guys have here today. And what we learned with the listing of the Delta smelt in California was that federal law can supersede everything that you do. And we didn't talk about that much this morning. There wasn't much discussion about the role of the Endangered Species Act. And I don't think Luke from the feedlots here still, but all of those cattle that go into that feedlot, not all of them, but the great bulk of them, come from the public lands in the western states. That's what I do. That's what our family does. We describe ourselves as we raise cattle, sheep, horses, dogs, children, and expectations. And so those cattle that are grazing in those public lands end up in these farms one way or another, eating corn or grain, or the other. Our family is about half and half sheep and cattle, and so those sheep that we raise on the western slope north of Steamboat and on the Colorado-Wyoming line end up, most of them, getting fed here in Weld and in Larimer County. And I'll tell you a great other story. 12 years ago, we saw the end of the sheep industry. It was just so small and so fragmented and so powerless. So a group of us got together and said, let's just make one last try at seeing if we can keep this industry together. And we, a dozen years later, we initially bought half of the largest lamb and veal company in the Bronx. bought the other half, and last month we bought the JBS lamb plant in Greeley. And so those Western Slope lambs from the 10 western states and 170 members come here pretty much, to be fed and processed. It's the largest antibiotic-free company in the United States, and that was just a bunch of ranchers that said, we want to keep our business, and so we think it's a good business right now. And so that's part of your, thing you got to figure out is you've got this incredible diversity, but you also are in a place that when people come here, I think they want to be more, and we all know the last person in shut the door behind them. That's not the reality. The reality, people want to be here. I had a meeting. Well, first let me say this. Seamus, would you stand up? Seamus is my number 2 grandson, and we think he may be the farmer in our family. He's got some mechanical skill, and so we're looking for a John Deere training school for 7-year-olds. But let me throw this statistic out at you. I am about to enter the fastest growing category of people in agriculture. Fastest growing category is 70 and above. And what that means is we have to figure out not only how do we keep the land and the water producing food for a growing world population, but how to talk the young people into doing it. If we don't figure that one out, it's a crisis. We're in a crisis. And what we have to do is tell those kids, not just the ones that are farm and ranch kids, but the kids that maybe want to be farmers and ranchers. We have to start figuring out ways to talk them into it, because we cannot, as a nation and as a region, persevere unless we, are smart enough to figure out how to have somebody want to do what we do. I was so great to see the lady here that talked about, her farm. What an example that is. And people, and even Reagan said today, it's very difficult if you don't have a farm. I believe that, but I also think that there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And the Family Farm Alliance had a program we did with young farmers last year in Durango. And so we went down there and met a whole lot of young farmers. And there are farmers with an acre of ground doing things with soils that is above me. I can't figure out exactly what they're getting to, but there's a revolution going on in soils. And it's happening with young people who want to be in agriculture and don't have the capability of getting in the way that, maybe they'd like to. But what I see is there's enough work ethic in people that want to be in farming. Some of those people who are just starting out that small, they're going to figure out a way because they want to be farmers. The other thing I think is a really great opportunity, you'd be surprised at how much federal land exists that isn't being used. Much more than you would think. And there's meetings going on right now with the Forest Service and the BLM about opening those lands back up, open those allotments back up to young people who could, start raising livestock, or maybe people that have a farm that could raise livestock part of the year and have them on their farm part of the year, or whatever combination it is. But we have to really go out of our way to be innovative, to figure out how to, how to incentivize, fund, and put a safety net on young people so that they get inspired that they're going to have an opportunity to do what we've all done, those of us that are old, and feed the world. I've got a lot of different notes here, and I wanted to mention our family and our valley has made a commitment to Upper Colorado fish, but we also made a real commitment to the sage grouse. And if you're living over here, it probably didn't really affect you. It was ground zero for us. And Wyoming has most of the sage grouse, and thank God our family has a lot. And so we were able to participate in the process of what's called the Wyoming plan so that the grouse didn't get listed. And if it had been listed, it would have been very equal to what happened with the Delta smelt in the West Coast. The federalizing of the process would have completely changed the way that we are able to raise food. Governor Meade from Wyoming took the lead on that. And in working with conservationists, a good friend of mine lives north of Fort Collins here, has a little horse ranch up there, and he's the head of the Audubon Society, Brian Rutledge. I don't know if any of you know Brian, but he was the instigator of a a statewide and ultimately a westwide process of not getting that bird listed. That didn't happen, thank goodness. But what the governor figured out, what a lot of us have figured out, and the governors of the other western states have figured out, is that the process of the Endangered Species Act isn't working. It isn't even coming close to working. And so last fall, but let me go back. The Family Farm Alliance is meeting in 2 weeks. Every year we come up with our recommendations on what is going to be our priority, and the priority is the Endangered Species Act because of what we saw, the devastation that's happening in California with farmers. We were able to put together a meeting in D.C. at the National Press Club last fall on the Endangered Species Act. And what's interesting is that Michael Bean from Fish and Wildlife Service, Jason Weller from the NRCS, myself, people from Western Governors, and people from the conservation side came together to see how we can do this so it works better. And when you think you have impediments, whatever level of impediments you're going to have in deciding what kind of Poudre River watershed you want to have, realize that the impetus of what's going on today is what I call the hopefuls and the hatefuls. You can spend your whole life hating and being mad and fighting about the 20% of the things you don't agree on, or you can spend your life on the 80% of the things that you do agree on, that you can get things done. And there's, the hatefuls in my mind are the litigators who have misused an Endangered Species Act that was passed virtually unanimously, because nobody that passed it thought it would be what it is today. But it has the potential to affect all of your businesses if you're an ag or anything. I mean, everything we're looking at has, because of all the potential listings are out there. I talked to a group from the Farm Foundation, mostly Midwestern and Eastern farmers, and there's a monarch butterfly and a long-eared bat and 100 other species that are going to directly affect them potentially. And so the debate on what the Endangered Species Act of the future is on right now, it will affect you. Because interestingly, the feedlot that's part of the JBS plant, those cattle and sheep, as I said, they come from all over the West to here. And the inability of that production to happen means that feedlot isn't going to be able to happen. And there were some questions today about livestock. All I know is that when people rise out of poverty and from the third world to the second world, the first thing they want is protein for their children. And the drive for meat protein, which is what I do, and we're pretty proud of it, is because when not only do we understand its value in this country, but it's going to become as much of the world is moving into a higher economic strata, they're going to want more protein because they realize, a balanced mixed diet is the best thing for raising your kids. Let's see. We had a meeting day before yesterday. I wanted to make sure I talked about this with people from the Colorado River District. And the Little Snake, which crosses the state line 12 times, the Colorado-Wyoming line, and our operations on both sides of the line, is interesting because in the Colorado River Compact it says everything developed above a certain point is equal between the states. And so the discussion between Colorado and Wyoming on the rights of the Colorado River, both states have significant rights, at least on paper, and each state wants to utilize whatever rights are realistic. So we had a meeting with the Yampa people, both ranchers and people from the district, and we had a slideshow, and I kind of didn't realize I hadn't seen it, and it's a kind of a more current technical show about what's happened on our river with the restoration, integration of irrigation and fishery and wildlife, and it is just amazing, and it's transferred itself from not just wildlife and production issues, but cottonwood gallery rejuvenation and oxbow rejuvenations. It's just a fascinating place to be. And Mary Lou brought a group of students up a couple of years ago, and there's going to be 14 students from CSU come up this summer, people from the University of Wyoming. And I would just invite any of you, if you want to see how a working river can work, come to the Little Snake. We'd be happy to show you stuff because we're very proud of it, and more proud than anything that when it came time to decide, are we going to fight over grazing issues or whatever, or are we going to show them that we can do whatever it takes to maintain that biodiversity that I think we're all looking for in the future? So, you know, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and I think there's a little bit of time for questions if anybody's interested.
So we've got time for questions, and we have 2 mics here. And Pat, you talk about the Endangered Species Act. I think clearly there is a lot of public support for the act. We don't want to see these species lost. Yet there's an interest with your group and others of reforming the act. Okay, so given that a huge segment of the public wants protection for these species, what are the reforms that really make sense? Why do we need to reform it? What would you do, Pat?
What's interesting in the 2 meetings, one was in Cody, one was in Boise, and the next one will be here in Colorado in March. What's interesting is with a very big cross-section of people, here's some of the points that are coming out. One, individual species is not the right way to go. And particularly when you look at a climate reality, the species you might be trying to protect here might be somewhere else, you know, very shortly, you know, in the timing of millennium. But more importantly than that, what's coming out is how do we protect landscapes? And that's across the board. And I think it's going to take a lot of intellectual discussion. A lot of smart people are going to have to figure out how you do that without being more onerous and regulatory than we already are. But I think one of the consensus discussions that's happening is we need to be looking at systems and how do we maintain landscapes. And I can tell you with the sage grouse, the reason that they're there is because you have large landscapes, and the reason that they go away is you industrialize or develop, and that habitat goes away.
So you're saying protect the habitats and focus on habitats, what I'm hearing you saying. Good, Pat.
My question, number 1, how much land or property do you own and or lease for your operation? And then question about beavers. How are they doing, and how much impact or effect do they have in terms of water management?
You know, it's kind of impolite to ask how much land there is, but we have private and public land. We're forest permittees and BLM permittees. We trail our sheep 150 miles one way and back every year from north of Steamboat to north of I-80 and different parcels we have. It's a good question about beavers because in our ranch, we have them that save us in the dry year by building dams in the forest in the draws. I mean, that's the water supply. But we trap beavers on the river when we're trying to irrigate. And I think they have a huge place in the system, you know, but you just have to, just like everything else, find the balance.
Okay, and they're not endangered? Or
No.
Okay.
There's a funny story, though. My father-in-law trapped one and took it. He put a cow ear tag in its tail and took it up to the forest where he was hoping that it would build some dams, and it virtually beat him back to the creek. So.
Pat, you mentioned several things of interest to me, being a young, kind of beginning farmer and rancher, but also about your grandson, as far as kind of retooling America's workforce. What sort of groundwork is being laid at the federal level to get us educated to run the country again?
Well, there are things that are happening. There's some better young farmer loans than there used to be. You know, and to me, I think there's 3 main pieces. I mentioned it before. One is adequate financing for a startup with no or virtually no interest, you know, getting somebody started. You've got to have a safety net. And when my wife and I started, you know, I can tell you, you have wrecks. And so you have to have a safety net so that, you know, young people can pass that safety net. And the third, and probably the most important, is mentorship. And you have to establish relationships between existing farmers and ranchers and people that don't have the experience in it. And the Wyoming stock growers have a program right now where they're trying to match up young people that want to be ranchers with no heirs. And that's because those ranchers that don't have an heir don't want to see that land turn into something other than that ranch they've spent whatever generations. So to me, that's the pieces you need. Some of them are in place, and I think the young farmer people that we're working with, you know, are working pretty hard to get that happen. One of the other ones is your college loans would be potentially reduced or eliminated if you get into agriculture, and I think that's a great idea.
So, Pat, I'm trying to think about what those of us on the Pooter can learn from you on the Little Snake. And a couple of questions. When you look at restoration along the Pooter, super expensive. Most of the land, of course, running through Fort Collins, we have a lot of natural areas, but downstream, it's all privately owned land. So how many miles of restoration did you guys do? What did that cost? Where'd the money come from? Okay. And then what did you do to enhance flow? I mean, that's really the master variable. And how did you do that other than just fixing stream banks?
Right, and I didn't talk as much about storage as I meant to, but we are the only transbasin diversion in Wyoming. The Little Snake goes to Cheyenne. That got us all geared up. You know, when we lost that water with the diversion, we thought, you know, rightfully we should have some storage. And I will tell you, politically, I spent some years in the legislature. Once an urban area gets its water, it's not that sympathetic to the rural area getting theirs. And it was a hard fight, and we got part of it. We're looking at another storage reservoir above us, above our ranch right off the Continental Divide, that would then, you know, bring water to the whole system. And if you don't understand what climate is about, climate cannot be about agendas. Climate has to be about solutions. And there's a lot of agendas out there, but when you understand what happens with the early runoffs like we had last year, or we'll probably have this year, or we've had for the last 10 years, you have to recapture that water, particularly in a basin like this one. And so we've got another reservoir proposed. And what, in terms of the total miles of restoration, I would say, you know, we've done 9 on our place. But the whole river is doing it, so I would say it's 30, 40, 50 miles easily. And the thing that, you know, answer your question about the Tonka toys in the river, what became interesting, you know, when we permitted our storage reservoir, it took 14 years, and I've used it as an example everywhere, talking about how difficult that was. When you put a biological component into a 404 permit, and working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, who was one of the funders, as well as NRCS. I'll be in D.C. in 2 weeks talking to Jason Weller about how we need to put more money into that kind of restoration using EQIP. I don't know if you know this, EQIP lost virtually $500 million in this last budget agreement because we weren't using it enough. And so when you look at yourselves, do you want to do restoration on the Pooter or tributaries or whatever? One, the relationship with the Fish and Wildlife Partners is with private landowners specifically. And the other is that the genius of Larry Hicks, who I mentioned, was his ability to recruit money from all kinds of places. And one of the other projects that I didn't talk about was he took a desert tributary, sagebrush desert tributary, and built a 3,500 acre wetland that went from 29 species of birds on the Continental Divide to 140 species that's now part of both the Atlantic and Pacific Flyway. And part of what you have to realize is you have so much opportunity if you have water. It's just, you know, you're limited only by your own creativity.
Pat mentioned EQIP. That's the USDA NRCS's cost share program for environmental quality incentives program, I think is that acronym that he threw out to you there. But a lot of on-the-ground conservation practices are funded through that. So, Pat, storage. Okay, so as I'm out and about, Ag is very supportive of storage. We want storage, but Ag can't afford to build storage for the most part. The projects that are teed up, they're all pretty much for urban, municipal, industrial use. Is there anything that the Family Farm Alliance sees that we can do for storage or additional water for Ag, given just the sheer cost of building storage, operating storage, and the economic realities of agriculture?
Well, in Wyoming, some really smart guys before I got in the legislature created the 1.5% tax on oil, gas, coal, and other non-renewables. And the philosophy was let non-renewables fund renewables. So we have a war chest of dollars to to build storage. And I would be surprised if there's a lot of federal money. But I will tell you, too, that the partners that we work with, Trout Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, others, have really come around to the fact that storage is critical. And if you don't store water with a warmer climate, you're going to end up with rivers that don't have fish and you can't irrigate off of. So I think, in Colorado particularly, where there's such a need for storage, and my vision is not super big storage anywhere, it's watershed appropriate storage everywhere. And what you have to look at is mill levies, and you look at some federal money, some state money, find partners. But Wyoming decided that rather than try to justify irrigators paying for storage, the governor said we're going to build 10 reservoirs in 10 years, 5 in 5 years, and they have 15 projects lined up, and we intend to do that.
My question is about your efforts to potentially revise the Endangered Species Act, because I'm curious to know if you're working with any of the groups that would otherwise be the litigators. I mean, where is the 80% consensus, and who are you working with to be able to get allies from those who would otherwise litigate against what you're trying to do? Where's that 80% agreement so that you can actually come to the table with some already pre-agreements with the environmental groups who might otherwise oppose it?
Right, and I think you really have to differentiate. I have my own way of describing it, but there is a discussion we've had with congressional people, and what they want is a real showing that there's a grassroots desire. And so when we asked Fish and Wildlife Service, NRCS, USDA to participate in a National Press Club press conference last year, we didn't really know whether we were in for a fight or whether we were, going to find a way to work together. And they showed up, and they've showed up at every meeting, because what's happening is there's not enough money. Forget the federal part. The game agencies in Colorado or Wyoming or Idaho or Nebraska, they're all struggling to keep up with the responsibilities of the way the act is being imposed. And it's not being imposed so that we, in my view, have as much biodiversity as possible and production. That's what the original intent of the act was. That what's happening is that everybody on the government level is realizing there's not enough money existing to do the kinds of things the litigators want. And at some point in time, I would say that at this point I don't see much interest to come to the table, because they've created an industry. And there's a book, I just got an email that there's a book about the Equal Access to Justice law, which is what funds the litigation. So there's a litigation industry that's very, makes money. And we're going to have to overcome that. But I would tell you that there's, in the discussions, which have been wide-ranging, the groups I mentioned and others have been at all the meetings so far, I just think there's a common interest that let's look into the future. What kind of America do we want? And it's not one where we're all being driven by litigation.
Okay, let's thank Pat. Great job, Pat. Thank you.